The man who stood before her was not a man at all, but a collection of severe angles and shadows, assembled in the shape of a duke. His name was Alistair Vance, Duke of Blackwood, and the name was a whisper of granite and winter frost in the solicitor's overheated London office. Elara Calloway sat perfectly still on the horsehair chair, her hands folded over the thin wool of her only respectable dress. She had been brought here like a parcel, her life signed away on a deed by the father who had squandered her dowry and the fiancé who had calculated her worth down to the last shilling. The Duke had not looked at her face. His gaze, a startlingly clear grey, had assessed the worn tips of her boots, the mended seam on her glove, and the straightness of her spine. He saw not a woman, but an inventory of resilience. "The terms are simple, Miss Calloway," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to absorb the light in the room. It was not unkind, but it was utterly devoid of warmth, the tone a man might use to discuss the purchase of a promising mare. "Your father's debts are considerable. Lord Harrington has relinquished his claim upon you in exchange for a consideration. I have purchased that claim." Elara did not flinch. She had spent the last of her tears in a locked room at her family's now barren estate. "You have purchased my marriage contract." It was not a question. For the first time, a flicker of something interest, perhaps, disturbed the placid cold of his eyes. "I have. I require a duchess. My estate, Blackwood, is vast, and has been without proper management for a decade. The solicitors have provided me with your history. You managed your father's accounts. You negotiated with his creditors. You possess a competence that is, I am told, unusual." He paused, the silence stretching until it became a weight. "I offer you a different sort of contract. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. You will have full authority over the household and its ledgers. In return, you will have sanctuary, security, and a life free from the whims of lesser men. You will be safe at Blackwood." He took a step closer, and the scent of cold air and iron followed him. "You will not, however, be loved. I do not offer affection, nor do I require it. Is that understood?" She met his gaze, this terrifying, unreadable man who spoke of a loveless life as if it were a gift. And perhaps it was. Safety was a currency she had never been able to afford. Cruelty wore the face of affection in her world. This cold, clear honesty felt like breathing clean air after a lifetime in a sick room. "Perfectly, Your Grace," she said, her own voice steady, a small polished stone in the vast silence of the room. He gave a single, sharp nod, the transaction complete. A door had closed on her old life, locking her into a new one, with a man who promised her everything but the one thing a bride was supposed to want. We hope this story finds you well. Subscribe for more tales of love found in the most unexpected of contracts, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Her life before the Duke had been a long, slow lesson in being invisible. At Linwood Park, her family's crumbling estate, Elara had been the silent engine that kept the facade from collapsing entirely. While her mother fretted over faded silks and her younger sisters practiced their watercolors, Elara was in her father's study, the scent of stale brandy and despair clinging to the velvet curtains. She was the one who reconciled the ledgers, who stretched a single sovereign to cover the butcher's bill and the stable boy's wages, who wrote carefully worded letters to creditors, pleading for another month, another week. Her father, Viscount Calloway, a man whose charm was as ruinous as his addiction to the gaming tables, would pat her head and call her his clever little mouse, never once acknowledging that her cleverness was the only thing keeping the roof over their heads. Her work was essential, but it was unseemly, a daughter's duty that should never be mentioned in polite company. Her fiancé, Lord Harrington, had been part of the facade. He was handsome, his smile a polished weapon, his words like spun sugar. He praised her quiet nature, her modesty. He once saw her at the desk, her brow furrowed over a column of figures, and had laughed. "My dear Ilara, leave the tedious work to the men. A woman's mind is too delicate for such things." He had then used the information she'd gathered to make a shrewd investment of his own, never crediting her. She had seen it then. The chilling truth. He did not love her. He sought to acquire her, along with the remnants of Linwood Park. He saw her competence not as a virtue to be admired, but as a resource to be exploited and then hidden away, like a useful but ugly piece of furniture. The betrayal, when it came, was therefore not a surprise, merely a confirmation. It happened in the same study where she had labored for years. Her father, his face pale and sweating, could not meet her eyes. Lord Harrington stood by the fireplace, casual and proprietary. "It is the most sensible solution, Ilara," her father had mumbled, shuffling papers. "The Duke of Blackwood. He has agreed to take on all my obligations." "His obligations being the debts you incurred?" Harrington clarified smoothly, his eyes on Ilara. "And your marriage contract. It is a fine match. A duchy is more than you could have hoped for." He spoke as if he had arranged a great triumph for her, as if selling her like livestock was an act of generosity. She looked at the ledgers on the desk, the neat columns of her own handwriting detailing the estate's slow death. They had used her work to calculate her value, to set the price for her sale. She had saved them from ruin for years, and her reward was to be sold to extinguish the final debt. She was given less than an hour to pack. Her mother wept for the social embarrassment of it all. Her sisters watched from their doorway, a mixture of pity and relief on their faces. It was only Sarah, the young housemaid who had been her one true friend, who showed any real sorrow. As Ilara was escorted to the waiting, unmarked carriage, Sarah pressed a small, heavy pouch into her hand. "For you, miss," she whispered, her own eyes bright with tears. "You were always the kindest." The pouch contained Sarah's savings. It was the only act of genuine love Ilara had known in that house, and she clutched it all the way to the cold, unknown lands of the Duke of Blackwood. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a passage through a landscape that grew progressively more severe. Rolling green hills gave way to stark, wind-swept moorland, the sky a sheet of pewter overhead. The carriage, though well-sprung and lined with dark leather, felt like a cage transporting her from one prison to another. When the manor finally came into view, it did not rise from the landscape so much as command it. It was a vast structure of dark grey stone, its lines clean and unforgiving, more fortress than home. There were no frivolous gargoyles, no welcoming ivy, only rows of tall, leaded glass windows that stared out like vacant eyes. The air itself seemed to change as they passed through the great iron gates, growing colder, stiller. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the wheels and the cry of a distant hawk. Ilara clutched the small pouch from Sarah, its weight a small, solid anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The carriage stopped before a set of massive oak doors, and a footman, as silent and grey as the house itself, opened her door without a word. She was met not by the Duke, but by a woman who seemed carved from the same stone as the manor. She was tall and thin, dressed in immaculate black, her grey hair pulled into a knot so severe it seemed to pull the skin taut across her cheekbones. "I am Mrs. Gable," she announced, her voice as crisp as autumn leaves. "The housekeeper. His Grace is occupied. I am to show you to your rooms." There was no welcome in her tone, only a statement of fact. She led Ilara through a great hall of breathtaking austerity. The floors were black and white marble, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold light from a high, vaulted ceiling. The walls were panelled in dark, almost black wood, unadorned by portraits or tapestries. The air smelled of beeswax, stone, and something else, the clean, sterile scent of a place long uninhabited by joy. Servants moved through the distant corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled, their presence felt but barely seen. They were efficient, silent, and watchful. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, sweeping staircase that seemed to climb into shadow, then down a long gallery to a heavy oak door. "This will be your wing," the housekeeper stated, opening it. The rooms within were spacious, furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture, and impeccably clean. A small fire had been laid in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill. It was a handsome prison, comfortable and cold. Through the tall window, Ilara could see a vast, walled garden, overgrown and tangled, a riot of neglect in an otherwise ruthlessly ordered world. It was the only thing in this place that seemed to have a soul, however wild. Later that evening, a young maid named Anya, with quiet hands and eyes that saw everything, informed her that His Grace would see her in the study. The study was a reflection of its master, a vast, book-lined room dominated by a massive desk of black walnut. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the window, a tall silhouette against the bruised twilight. He turned as she entered, his face as unreadable as it had been in London. He did not ask her about her journey or her comfort. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk, and once she was seated, he laid out the terms of their life with the precision of a general outlining a campaign. "You are now the Duchess of Blackwood," he began, his voice filling the quiet room. "Your duties are as we discussed. You will have unrestricted access to the household accounts, the estate ledgers, and all correspondence related to its management. You will report to me once a week, on Friday mornings, here in this study." He paused, his grey eyes fixed on hers. "You will have your own wing. You will not enter my private quarters, which are in the East Wing. I will not enter yours. We will dine together on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the main dining hall. For the remaining evenings, you may take your meals in your rooms. We will be required to make one public appearance in London per season to satisfy the gossips and the terms of my inheritance. Beyond that, your time is your own." He spoke of their shared existence as if it were a timetable for a railway. There was no room for ambiguity, no space for emotion. "In return for your services, you will have my protection. No one from your past life will trouble you here. You will receive a quarterly allowance for your personal use, which you will find is more than generous. I expect efficiency, discretion, and honesty. I will offer you the same." He fell silent, waiting. Ilara looked at this man, this fortress of a man, and felt a strange sense of calm. The cruelty she had known was wrapped in smiles and false endearments. This cold, brutal honesty was a foundation she could build upon. It was survivable. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace," she said. He nodded once, a gesture of finality. Their contract had begun. Ilara's new life at Blackwood Manor began not with fear or sorrow, but with work. Work was a language she understood, a structure she could impose on the vast, echoing silence of the house. On her first morning, she requested the household ledgers from a wary Mrs. Gable. They were delivered to her private sitting room on a silver tray, 3 enormous leather-bound volumes. The books were, as she expected from the state of the house, impeccably neat. But neatness was not the same as efficiency. For 2 days she did nothing but read, tracing the flow of funds for tallow candles, for Belgian lace, for barrels of French wine that were purchased at exorbitant prices from a single London supplier. She saw patterns of waste, of loyalty overriding logic. Her first act was to draft a letter to a different supplier, one she knew from her time at Linwood to be both fair and discreet, proposing a new arrangement. She did not ask for permission. The Duke had given her authority, and she intended to use it. Mr. Croft, The estate steward, a portly man who had served the Duke's father, objected immediately. "We have always dealt with Phillips and Sons, Your Grace," he said, his tone bordering on insolent. Alara simply laid out the figures on the desk between them. "And for that loyalty, Mr. Croft, we are paying 20% more for inferior goods. The arrangement will change." The steward retreated, muttering, but the order was changed. A week later, when the first new shipment arrived, of better quality and for less cost, a quiet ripple of respect went through the staff. She turned her attention next to the house itself. She walked its corridors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. She discovered entire wings shuttered and draped in white linen, rooms filled with furniture that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade. She didn't open them, not yet. She was learning the rhythms of the place, its deep, quiet breaths. She learned that the staff, though skeletal for a house of this size, moved with a silent, synchronized grace, managed by Mrs. Gable with military precision. Her maid, Anya, was a source of quiet information. It was Anya who told her the East Wing had been the late Duchess's and had been sealed upon her death years ago. It was Anya who left a warm cup of milk sweetened with honey by her bedside each night, a small, unspoken kindness that felt enormous in the house's emotional vacuum. And it was the neglected garden that called to her most. It was a wild, forgotten place, choked with weeds, but the bones of it were beautiful. She found an ancient groundskeeper named Silas, his back bent like a yew tree, who was still tending a small patch of herbs by the kitchen door. He looked at her with suspicion when she first arrived, dressed in a simple work dress, with gloves and shears in hand. She didn't give orders. She simply asked him to show her where the old rose bushes were. Together they began the slow work of reclamation, clearing tangled briars, pruning back dead wood, turning over the soil. It was hard, physical work that left her hands sore and her body tired, but it cleared her mind. In the evenings, she would see the Duke watching her. From his study window, or from the stone balustrade of the terrace. He never approached, never spoke. He just watched, his tall frame a motionless silhouette, his expression impossible to read from a distance. Their twice-weekly dinners were silent, formal affairs in a dining hall that could have seated 50. They spoke of the estate, of the weather. But a change was slowly taking place. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of a great house coming back to life, and with the shared, unspoken awareness of two people coexisting in its vast, cold spaces. The library at Blackwood was Ilara's sanctuary. It was the one room in the house that felt lived in, though not by its current master. It was 2 stories high, lined with books from floor to ceiling, with a rolling ladder and 2 deep, worn leather armchairs by a fireplace large enough to stand in. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke, a scent she found deeply comforting. She spent most of her evenings there, working on the estate archives, a chaotic collection of documents spanning 3 centuries of the Vance family. It was a task no one had asked her to do, but it gave her a sense of the house's history, its soul. It was in the library that her silent coexistence with the Duke began to shift. He would often enter late at night, long after the house was asleep, to fetch a book. He would nod to her, a brief acknowledgement of her presence, and retreat. But one night, instead of leaving, he poured himself a brandy and took the armchair opposite hers. They sat in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of turning pages. It was a strange, unexpected intimacy. It was during one such late night, while cataloguing deeds from the early 1800s, that she found it. Tucked away on a high shelf, behind a row of dry legal texts, was a slim, locked folio bound in dark green leather. It was newer than the surrounding books, its lock modern. Curiosity, a feeling she had long suppressed, stirred within her. The key she discovered after a day of searching was in a small hidden drawer of the main library desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned it in the lock. The folio contained not old deeds, but recent correspondence. Letters. And as she read the first one, a cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her feel faint. The letters were between Duke Alistair Vance and Sir Reginald Pike, the man who held the largest of her father's gambling debts, the very man whose threats had precipitated her family's final collapse. The correspondence was methodical, chillingly precise. It detailed Alistair's systematic purchase of every one of her father's outstanding markers. He hadn't simply bought her marriage contract from Lord Harrington, he had engineered the entire crisis. He had systematically dismantled her father's financial standing, cornered him, and left him with no option but to sell his only remaining asset. Her. The final letter was dated 1 week before her arrival at Blackwood. In it, Sir Reginald confirmed the transfer of the last debt. "The Viscount is broken," it read. "The daughter is yours." The words swam before her eyes. This wasn't a rescue. It was a meticulously planned acquisition. Her safety, her sanctuary. It was a cage he had built for her before she even knew she was trapped. Why? Was it some cold, calculated desire to own something or someone that others had failed to appreciate? Was she merely a rare book to be added to his collection? The trust she had begun to feel, fragile as a spun glass ornament, shattered. She clutched the letters, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her palm. That night, she waited for him in the library, the folio resting on the table between the two chairs. When he entered, he saw it, and his face, usually a mask of control, tightened by a fraction. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You did not save me from the fire," she said, her voice low and clear as a bell in the silent room. "You set it. Why?" He looked at the letters, then at her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in his grey eyes. It was not guilt. It was something far more complex. He didn't deny it. "Because it was the only way," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Harrington was not simply going to marry you. He was part of a syndicate that preys on indebted families. They strip the assets, ruin the women, and move on. Your father was merely their latest mark. Leaving you to him was not an option." It was an explanation, but it wasn't an answer. It explained the how, but not the why. Why her? The crisis of trust was now a chasm between them, deep and terrifyingly wide. The weeks that followed were colder than her first days at Blackwood. The fragile truce of their shared silences was broken, replaced by a tense, guarded quiet. They still dined together on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the clink of silver on porcelain echoing in the cavernous dining hall. He answered her questions about the estate with his usual precision, and she delivered her reports with cold professionalism. But the nascent warmth was gone, extinguished by the discovery of his orchestration. She continued her work in the gardens, but the joy had gone out of it. She felt his eyes on her from the house, but now his observation felt less like curiosity and more like ownership. She had exchanged one cage for another, a gilded one, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. She was his possession, acquired through methodical, ruthless strategy. The knowledge was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The past she thought she had escaped arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a gleaming black carriage and a calling card presented on a silver tray. Lord Harrington. Ilara's blood ran cold. Mrs. Gable, who presented the card, had an expression of profound disapproval. "He is in the blue salon, Your Grace," he insisted. Ilara stood, her hands clenched at her sides. She would not hide. This was her house now, however she had come to be in it. She walked to the salon, her spine straight. Harrington was standing by the window, admiring the view of the moorland, looking as elegant and predatory as ever. He turned as she entered, his smile a flash of white teeth. "Alara, my dear," he said, his tone oozing a false concern that made her skin crawl. "I had to see for myself that you were well. One hears such stories about the Duke. A recluse, they say. Morose. I could not rest easy, knowing you were in such a place." He was playing a part, the concerned former fiancé, come to rescue the damsel. He was assessing the territory, looking for weakness. "I am perfectly well, Lord Harrington," she said, her voice even. "Your concern is unnecessary." "Is it?" He took a step closer, his eyes sweeping over her plain but well-made dress. "You belong at Linwood with your family, not in this mausoleum. This arrangement, it is not suitable. I have spoken with your father. He regrets his haste. I am prepared to renegotiate with the Duke. To take you back." He spoke as if she were a piece of property that had been misplaced. He believed he still owned her. Before she could form a reply, a quiet presence filled the doorway. Alistair. He had entered without a sound, a tall, dark pillar of controlled fury. He did not look at Harrington. His eyes were on Alara. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, a silent offer of support, not salvation. The air in the room crackled with tension. Harrington's smile faltered for a second. "Your Grace," he said, recovering. "I was just telling Alara that her family wishes for her return." It was the sight of Alistair beside her, the solid, unwavering fact of his presence, that unlocked something in Alara. She had spent her life being silent, being overlooked. No more. She turned her gaze fully on Harrington, her voice clear and cold. "My family sold me to settle a debt you encouraged. You have no standing here. This is my home. The Duke is my husband." She took a breath, the years of poring over ledgers giving her a weapon he had never imagined she possessed. "And I would be careful, my lord. I have reviewed Blackwood's accounts, as well as the history of my father's. It is remarkable how often your name appears connected to properties that suddenly fail, only to be purchased for a pittance by a holding company you secretly control. The scheme is quite intricate, and quite illegal." Harrington's face went pale. The charming facade dissolved, revealing the shocked fury beneath. He had expected a timid, broken girl. He found a Duchess with a mind like a steel trap. He stammered, then turned on his heel and strode from the room without another word. The sound of his carriage departing was a victory. When he was gone, Alara felt a tremor run through her. Alistair was still beside her. He hadn't moved. The silence returned, but it was different now. They had faced a threat together, not as lord and possession, but as allies. That night the house felt different, as if the confrontation had cleared the air of a lingering poison. Alara could not settle. She found herself drawn to the library, the heart of the house. The fire was burning low, casting long, dancing shadows across the spines of the books. Alistair was there, standing before the hearth, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece. He was staring into the flames, but she knew he had heard her enter. She stopped just inside the room, the space between them filled with everything that had been said, and, more importantly, everything that had not. He turned his head, his profile etched by the firelight. The rigid control he usually maintained seemed to have softened, his shoulders less tense, his expression unguarded. "You were formidable today," he said, his voice a low murmur. It wasn't a compliment, it was a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet note of awe. "He thought I was still the girl he knew at Linwood," she replied, moving closer to the warmth of the fire. He did not account for the education I have received here. A long silence fell between them, but it was not the cold, empty silence of weeks past. This was a silence of consideration, of reassessment. He finally turned to face her fully, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. The walls were gone. The careful, remote facade he had maintained for so long had crumbled, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. "My first wife," he began, his voice rough with disuse, as if he were speaking a language he had long forgotten. "Her name was Isabel. She did not love me. She loved my title, my fortune. She conspired with my cousin to have me declared incompetent. They meant to take everything, to have me committed to an asylum. I discovered the plot just in time. The betrayal. It hollowed me out. I sealed off the East Wing. I sealed off myself. I vowed I would never again allow a person that close. I vowed to trust only in contracts, in ledgers, in things that could be quantified and controlled." He looked around the library, at the books, the accounts she had been working on. "I saw your work before I ever saw you. I had my agents send me reports from your district. I saw how you held your father's estate together through sheer will and intelligence. I saw integrity. I thought I was acquiring an asset, something of unimpeachable value to protect my own broken world." He took a hesitant step toward her. "I did not account for the woman. I did not account for your courage, or your quiet kindness to the staff, or the way you have brought the gardens and this house back to life." His gaze was intense, holding hers. "I told you I would not love you. It was the primary clause in our contract, the one I believed would keep me safe." He reached out, his fingers barely brushing hers. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder. "I find I have broken the terms. My calculations were incorrect. Alara," he said her name for the first time, and it sounded like both a question and a prayer. "I am no longer content with our arrangement." He took her hand, his grasp not possessive, but seeking. A plea for a new contract, one not written in ink, but felt in the silent, fire-lit space between two broken people who were, against all odds, beginning to make each other whole. Alistair's next move was as strategic and bold as his acquisition of her had been. He announced he would be hosting the annual Blackwood Ball, an event that had been the jewel of the London season a decade ago, but had been dormant since his retreat from society. The invitation caused a sensation. It was a clear signal. The Duke of Blackwood was returning, and he was presenting his mysterious new Duchess to the world. Alara knew it for what it was, a battlefield. Lord Harrington would be there, his whispers of scandal and poison spreading through the drawing rooms. This was Alistair's declaration of war on her behalf. In the weeks leading up to the ball, the manor was transformed. Shuttered wings were opened, dust covers removed, and an army of temporary staff polished silver and hung crystal chandeliers. Alara oversaw it all with a calm efficiency that earned her even deeper respect from Mrs. Gable. Alistair did not give her a gift of jewellery or trinkets. Instead, he brought a dressmaker from Paris. Her gown was not the white of a debutante, but a deep midnight blue silk, the colour of the moorland sky at twilight. It was a dress for a queen, not a bride. The night of the ball, the great hall was ablaze with light and filled with the murmur of 1,000 conversations. As Alara descended the grand staircase on Alistair's arm, a hush fell over the crowd. She was not the timid, cast-off mouse they had been expecting. In her magnificent gown, her head held high, she was every inch the Duchess. They moved through the crowd, a united front. The whispers followed them, but Alistair's presence, his hand resting firmly in the small of her back, was a shield. Midway through the evening, Harrington made his move. He cornered Alara near the terrace, his cronies forming a small, intimidating circle. "You look well for a prisoner," he sneered, his voice low. "Does he let you out of your cage often?" Before she could answer, Alistair was there. He did not challenge Harrington to a duel. His methods were far more modern and far more devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen." Alistair's voice cut through the ballroom chatter, clear and commanding. He stood on the musician's dais, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "I thank you for joining us tonight. I have a small announcement regarding a business matter." A ripple of confusion went through the room. Harrington paled. Alistair proceeded, with the cold precision of a surgeon, to lay bare Harrington's entire criminal enterprise. He named the holding companies, the fraudulent bankruptcies, the ruined families. He had documents, affidavits, correspondence. It was a masterpiece of investigation, and it implicated not only Harrington, but several other powerful men standing in the very room. The final piece of evidence was Harrington's own correspondence, outlining his plan to marry Alara, strip her family's assets, and then cast her aside. "My wife," Alistair said, his voice ringing with pride as he looked directly at Alara, "was the one whose financial acumen first alerted me to these discrepancies. Her intelligence is the reason this network of corruption is now exposed to the light. He had not rescued her. He had armed her, validated her, and named her value before the entire world." In the stunned silence that followed, officers of the law, whom Alistair had waiting, stepped forward and took a sputtering, ruined Lord Harrington into custody. The ball was over. As Alistair and Alara left the ballroom, the crowd parted for them, their whispers no longer of scandal, but of awe. They had arrived as a mystery and were leaving as a legend. Months passed. The scandal of the Blackwood Ball faded into the stuff of drawing-room legend, leaving behind a new and unassailable respect for the Duke and his brilliant Duchess. The London season came and went, but they paid it little mind. Their world was here, at Blackwood, within the grey stone walls that no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary they had built together. Spring arrived on the moors, coaxing green from the dark earth and dusting the gorse with brilliant yellow flowers. The garden, once a tangled wreck, was now their shared project and greatest joy. Under Alara's guidance and Silas's ancient wisdom, the old roses had been pruned back to life and were now covered in tight, promising buds. Paths were cleared, fountains cleaned, and neat rows of herbs and vegetables grew near the kitchen. The garden's restoration was a mirror to their own. What had been neglected and walled off was now thriving, open to the sun. They often worked there together in the late afternoons, after their respective duties were done. The silence between them now was a comfortable living thing, punctuated by the snip of shears and the hum of bees. One warm evening they stood on the upper terrace, looking down at the transformed landscape. The setting sun bathed the manor in a soft golden light, warming the stone and making the new green of the lawns vibrant. Alara leaned against the balustrade, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a deep sense of peace settling over her. Alistair came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. He reached out and gently brushed the dirt from her cheek, his touch lingering for a moment. He then took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple, profound gesture of belonging. "The terms of our contract have all been met, I believe," he said, his voice quiet, for her ears alone. She smiled, turning her hand to grip his. "I believe they have." He looked from the thriving garden to her face, his grey eyes, once so cold, now filled with a steady, unwavering warmth. "Then it is time for a new one," he said. "One with no clauses, no conditions, a partnership, a life." He did not need to use the word love. It was there in the way he held her hand, in the way he looked at her, in the way he had dismantled his own fortress, stone by stone, to let her in. It was in the shared work of their hands, in the home they had made from a house. The final image was of them standing together as dusk fell, two figures against the vast, enduring landscape, hands linked, their future stretching before them, as full of promise as the garden in spring. Thank you for joining us for this story. We are so glad you were here. Would you have trusted him after discovering his secret? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Remember, sometimes the best alliances begin as the most honest transactions.